Hello and welcome back to Season 2 of the Adventures in CRE audio series. Today we are joined by guest Ben Stevens and we're talking about the birth of a LIHTC building. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Adventures in CRE audio series. Join Michael Belasco and Spencer Burton as they pull back the curtain on everything commercial real estate and introduce you to some of the top minds in the industry. If you want to take your skills to the next level and be part of a growing community of CRE professionals across the world, this is for you.
All right. Thank you guys so much for visiting and being with us today. We're really excited. Today we have in studio Spencer and Michael in studio, as well as Ron Rohde. Thanks for being here again, Ron. And then we've got Ben Stevens remotely. Ben, how you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
We're really excited to have you here today. So I'm going to turn this thing right over to Spencer, who's going to introduce you, Ben, as well as kind of the topic here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have Ben on. Ben's a friend. We've known each other now for quite a few years, met while he was actually an MBA candidate at the University of Wisconsin. So first off, background about Ben, he's a project manager for a real estate development firm in Chicago. He holds an MBA in real estate and urban land economics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. On the side, Ben hosts the Skyline Forum. It's an online interview series with developers, architects, and urban planners. He's also the author of the new book, The Birth of a Building, which is just a phenomenal book, introduction to the various aspects that go into developing real estate, such as finance, law, urban planning, architecture, engineering, and construction. We'll talk a little bit more about the book later on, but it's a great way to understand the various elements that go into developing real estate. Ben lives with his wife, Rebecca, son Elijah, and daughter Caroline, as I mentioned, in Chicago. So Ben, hey, really good to have you on the audio series.
Oh yeah, fantastic to be here. I've enjoyed watching your site. I don't know how old it was when I first discovered it, but really excited to see how it's blossoming in this series. So that's fantastic work you guys are doing. Great to be here.
So the topic today, there's a couple of things we want to go over. We hear a lot from our a.cre readers around affordable housing, both how you structure affordable housing deals, what makes an affordable housing deal pencil. There's some modeling elements to it.
Right.
But high level, when you read in the newspaper or someone says to you affordable housing, what is that even?
Right.
Talk to us about that.
It's not 10 or 20 years ago, but a few different aspects. So in the plain sense of the word, if somebody says, is your housing affordable, they just may mean, do you pay a certain percentage of your income, maybe 25%, to live where you live, whether you're renting or you're owning? Because if you're paying much more than that, then it can make life difficult. So that's maybe the plainest sense of the word. But there's a economic question, and that's, is there enough housing like that? And if there's not enough housing that's affordable, why is that not the case? When people today talk about the, quote, affordable housing debate, that's usually what they're referring to. Then there's the political question. If there isn't enough affordable housing, should the government get involved? Is that one of their responsibilities? Why or why not? And finally, there's the financial question, which is, if the government gets involved in some financial way to solve the problem, how should they do that? And so, as you can imagine, each of these questions has a life of its own. I won't pretend to be an expert in all or any of them, but that's the landscape of the different things people debate. And so I think having those different categories in mind can help us as we, pursue this conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that definitely does. So we are real estate developers. Let's hypothetically or not, let's put ourselves in or put that hat on. How do we solve that affordable housing problem? And what are some of the tools that exist out there to help us, solve affordable housing?
Well, I would say the interesting part about that question is that people have been debating this obviously for a very long time, and we're kind of, if this was the Star Wars trilogy, I just know the original three, sorry. But if this was the Star Wars, I don't know how many there are now, but this is like episode 3 or the third episode. And there's been a bit of a story before us that's both interesting from those modeling perspectives about what tools we have, because they're kind of iterations of things that came before us. But it's also just interesting, I would say, for understanding 20th century social history. So let me give you a very brief version of that story, because I think learning from the lessons in the past and what went wrong is kind of why we have the tools that we have, and it makes them more intelligible. So for almost 200 years, the US government did not want to be involved in housing in any way. It's not their business, so that's not surprising. And their first intervention and getting involved in making affordable housing, and I'm talking here about subsidized housing, to make that possible, was to institute building codes to try to make buildings safer. But starting with the New Deal in the 30s and then going into World War II, they changed their position dramatically. And they actually started playing the role of developer and owner of real estate themselves directly. And that was what we know as public housing. And at the time, I think that decision was just as much about making housing that was safe or decent as making it affordable. Because you remember, in the early 20th century or the late 19th century, you might have 6 or 8 people in a room, no windows, gas fumes. I mean, that was actually the problem. And it may have been affordable, but it was dangerous and substandard. And so over time, we've drastically raised the bar on on quality, but that's actually created, in some senses, this affordability problem. Did you have a question?
Yes, sir. So you're saying that the genesis of public housing was not affordability, but public safety, or are you saying
I think there's a both and. But I mean, if I don't often quote Lenin, but Lenin said there's no space or affordable problem. You take the total number of people divided by the number of square feet, and that's how many square feet everybody gets. So there was this mentality, and even in books like, some of the books that really triggered the whole movement were books like How the Other Side Lives. And it just depicted very graphically the squalor that people were living in. I know if you've spent time in New York, like the dumbbell apartments where there'd be like 10 or 15 units and they just basically had an air shaft. So it may have been affordable, or it may not have been, but I think the front burner issue in a lot of people's minds was not the affordability of the housing, but the housing stock, or like whether it was good enough. And I do believe that was a strong reason. And for that reason, a lot of people were excited to move into housing, both in Germany, for example, where I spent a long time, and in the US, because this was brand new housing. And they were coming from really dangerous and dilapidated housing. So that's one of the complicated. But let me. That segues though. So this experiment didn't go that well for long, despite the fact that there were a lot of really great people involved, and still are, in public housing. But as we said earlier, this isn't the government's business. It's not surprising. And so when they took on this role of developer owner, a number of comical or tragic decisions were made, to cut costs. I mean, a famous example, Pruitt-Igoe, which is one of the biggest public housing developments ever in St. Louis. One of the ways that they value engineered and cut costs was that the elevator only stopped every other floor.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if Heinz would have ever looked at something like that. Really get the meat off the bone. But so there were very poor design decisions. That's just one example. But interestingly, one of the things that held it together was the rent structure, because even though the government developed it, they were a landlord like anyone else. And most of the people in public housing, when it started, paid their rent with their income. They had jobs. If they didn't pay their rent, they were evicted. So it had a lower middle class feel. But in the 60s, and I'm coming to the end of the story here, in the 60s, everything changed. And public housing kind of started its descent into this dangerous thing that we came to know it as. And that happened when HUD decided to start using income-based rent. So the idea was, whatever a person's income is, their rent is going to be 30% of that amount. And on the face of it, of course, that makes sense. But it meant that the people for whom public housing, was the best deal were people with no income. Yeah. Because 30% of zero is zero. And so,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's a lot of complicated math in real estate. This is not that math. So all of a sudden, you have thousands of people in public housing who have no jobs, either because they're physically disabled or mentally disabled, chronically unemployed for some reason. And then to make matters worse, the government had, approximately $0 set aside for capital expenditures and repairs. You had the crack war, it got really scary. And the long story is the government decided to get out of the development business in favor of two new private solutions. And that kind of brings us to the modern era. Does that make sense? I know that's a big story, but it's important.
Yeah, and you said that's the end of the story, but so where does it go from there? What were these initiatives that bring us to today?
Right. So there's two different ways the government kind of thought of that it could be involved in a private way and to subsidize housing and make it affordable. So the first is you can help the tenants directly, and that's the voucher system, Section 8. The other side, that's the demand side. People want apartments, and you meet them at the demand stage, and you give them a voucher, and they can go basically anywhere within reason and use that voucher. The other side is the tax credit system, which is to say you help the developer directly. It's a supply side, and so the voucher basically, if you have a voucher, you go rent an apartment from whomsoever, and you pay 30% of your income and they pay whatever is above that of your rent. And sometimes it moves around with you, but sometimes it's project-based. And interestingly, as I understand it, Related, massive developer, as many of your listeners will know, got its start with Section 8 properties. So buying properties that had these vouchers on them. And if you take, I'm currently privatizing in about 3 weeks, we're closing. When you take a public housing property out, if you do it that way, you get to keep the operating subsidies. And so you can have a private property that has those vouchers tied to it. Anyway, that's how Related, that's one of the ways, as I understand it, that it kind of got its start. But go ahead. Yeah.
So the title of our episode here, the birth of a LIHTC building. What is LIHTC? For those who don't know, LIHTC.
Right. So to finally come to our subject, the other way to invest, for the government to invest, is to help the developer out and to make the building itself more affordable by changing the capital stack. So that's what I'm currently involved in, and most people know it as the low-income housing tax credit. So if Mike or if Spencer has a deal, maybe you're looking at between 60 and 80% loan to value. So you're getting a lot of debt, and then you have some investor and sponsor equity. If you look at what 70 or 80%, then especially on the equity, you owe something every year, right? So if it's a $100 million building, you owe a certain amount on all those dollars every year, and that sets a rent floor. You can't go below that, even if, for goodwill reasons. You have to have that much or you'll go into default. But we finance almost 70% of our projects with what amounts to free money. We don't have to pay it back. We don't have to pay a return. The deal that I'm closing in a couple weeks is 11% levered, when we on the perm stage.
Wow.
And so that allows us basically to have a similar quality building. That's our goal. You can't tell it's a quote low income building, and we charge low rents, but because we have such a tiny amount of capital that has any kind of repayment or return requirements, we can make it work. And in the book on page 224, I have a table that kind of contrasts the cost of capital, or what I call the cash flow obligation of a market property to a affordable property. But we can get into, so next maybe we can talk about the process of how you get them, because that explains a bit more of the story. But that's the idea. We're using free money. And so obviously if you have a $10 million building, you get $7 million, for basically for free from tax credits. And then you get maybe another $1 million of soft money from a variety of different sources. Then you have a little bit of debt. It's the same building, but we have extremely low debt service, and we don't have any equity return requirements. So we can charge a low rent and it still pencils. That's the essence of it.
So if you could, it may be difficult, it may be easy. Could you walk us through, let's say you are looking at a site and you're looking for development opportunity here, and you find this viable site. How does one go about this process? How does one size the loan? How does one go for the LIHTC? How do you get my understanding, and maybe it's incorrect, is that you get funded on, you get the LIHTC at the stabilization period, but then you have to develop it, and maybe you get a piece of that funding earlier on. And maybe I'm totally misrepresenting how this works.
Sure.
So, I know that you size it based on, the projected rent. At least that's how I understand it. But then you need to fund it back in the beginning, and there's some sort of construction financing going on. Or maybe you can walk us through how that works. And then on the back end, once you stabilize, then the LIHTC comes in. I'm not sure. Maybe you can definitely explain it much clearer and more defining way. Great to hear.
Well, to go back to your thing, when you're looking for a site, it's very different because to give a bit more detail, every state gets a certain amount of credits from the federal government every year. It's basically the number of people in that state multiplied by like $3, right? Mm-hmm. Well, then every state sets up a point system, and they determine every year. Each state has its own new point system every year. So you can imagine it's complicated to do it in a lot of different places. But they determine every year what the highest criteria are for them in their funding. And there's a contest. And so everybody submits their projects. 30 to 40% get funded, kind of, I'd say, as a good baseline expectation. So when we talk about, you have the site and you want to get credits, really it's the other way around. Mm-hmm. You get what's called the QAP. It's basically their point system. You get that and you read it, and so for example, I was doing a deal in Salt Lake City, and we see, okay, they're going to award points for sites that are near redevelopment authority zone 7, and points if it's within a quarter mile of the red line, and points if it's close to a grocery store that takes this kind of subsidized food stamp, whatever. So I make a map that basically puts a buffer around, I find all those different points, and I make a map that puts a buffer around them. And then I start looking for overlaps. And then we try to find a piece of land that is in all those, ideally something that maybe is owned by the city. We can get it for free. Mm-hmm. And so you have to start, and this is the weird thing about this industry, you have to start with their point system, because we'll have people bring a piece of land to us and say, hey, this is a great site. Maybe it was a great site according to the point system 5 years ago, but we'll never get the credits because they say it could be, for example, there are parts of Chicago that have had a tremendous amount of low-income housing development. And so the state agency doesn't want any more there, because the whole thing they're trying to get away from is over concentration of it in any one particular place. So we eventually get a site, and please stop me if you have a question, but we try to find a site that scores well. That's really the entire key. Now, it's not always easy because, of course, they want it in a really expensive area. But you find a site that scores well. And then you begin, looking at the model. And if you want to go through the model, we can do that. But to get your allocation, so the allocation is set up like this. In the development budget, the capital budget, there are certain costs which are eligible and certain costs that are not eligible. So land is not eligible for the reason that they don't want you to overpay for land and then try to get tax credits for it. But most other costs are eligible. And so in your budget, you say, this construction interest after stabilization is not eligible, or syndicator fees not eligible, but these other things are. And you end up with this number that is your quote unquote eligible basis. And then you multiply that in the case of a competitive application by 9%, which is the credit rate, times 10 years, times the going credit rate. So maybe it's 95 cents or something.
And when you say going credit rate, excuse me for stopping you, that's what a financial institution, for instance, would pay for those credits, right?
So and that's an important clarification. So when we win these tax credits, so let's say I win, how many do I have in the case of this deal? Like 11 or 12 million. So if I win $12 million of tax credits, my firm doesn't have a $12 million tax obligation.
Right.
So syndicator, and they give us the cash in return. So we had a deal that Apple was the capital partner. Apple had this tax liability, and they paid us a certain amount. And the going rate for the credits depends on where you are. And it depends very heavily, in particular, on the concentration of financial institutions, maybe that have a CRA obligation, Community Reinvestment Act. They have to invest locally. And so they are willing to bid up that price because they want a project there and they want to be able to show that they're in compliance.
Right.
But it's also interesting because if it's someone like Bank of America or one of these lenders, they can do the debt and the equity. So maybe they buy the credits and that's the equity. And so they give us the cash equity, but they also want to do the debt. So it's a business transaction on the debt side, that's their business, but they're also taking what would have been a tax payment and earning like a 5.5% IRR on it.
Yeah. So at what stage are they buying those credits? Is that prior
That's right,
to
yes.
construction start, or is that at completion, or is that phased over the period? How does that work?
They get them over a certain period. So we, when we start out, the construction phase looks almost like any other transaction. You have 80% construction loan, and usually you have maybe 15% of the credits or 20% of the credits, but you get them in installments.
Okay.
Now, in some sense, that's negotiable with the equity people because they are the ones who are going to be getting the tax credits, and they're looking at a variety of things about when they are going to start seeing the building online and so on. But generally we get maybe 15, 20% at close. And then you get maybe a certain percent at temp CO, and then a certain percent at stabilization, and then a certain percent, usually more nominal, at 8609, which is when the IRS says, okay, this is exactly how you portrayed it to us. And so those come in installments. And when we get those installments, it's used to pay off the construction loan and things of that nature. And then over the years, the investor is able to, in their tax return, take those different amounts of losses. But they're also, so the credits are one piece, but they're also looking at the depreciation. The strange thing, and you were talking about sizing the debt, the strange thing about the debt is, so we've got the tax credits, maybe that's 70% of our capital stack. And then we say, okay, how much debt can we get? The agencies like to spread the credits around for political reasons, I'd say, as much as they can to different projects so that they can show, hey, we did 20 projects when we just did 18 last year. Well, it's based on the number of citizens in a state. So it's usually not going up tremendously unless they're, in Texas or some hot market like that. So where I have a lot of projects. So what they do is they say there's a certain maximum allocation that you can request. Maybe it's $1 million a year for 10 years, so 10 million, or maybe it's $1.5 million, is the case in Chicago. And that kind of caps the project size. And so we have a certain number of credits, and then I go, and the agency, when it's sizing the max credits that it'll give us, says, well, we want you to get a loan such that you maintain a minimum of 1.15 or 1.2 debt service coverage every year. And a key difference and an oddity that one has to get used to in Affordable is the underwriting standard usually says you must model 2% revenue growth and 3% expense growth.
Yeah.
So you essentially are coasting down every year. It may be even tighter than that, honestly. You may just have 1% revenue growth. But in any case, what you essentially do is you do a min calculation on your NOI, and you say, what's the minimum over the 15-year compliance period? What's the minimum NOI that I have? You divide that by the debt service coverage ratio that the agency requires. That gives you the max payment, and then you use that to back into the loan. So then you sit back and you say, this is the equity that I can get based on their caps and my eligible basis. And then this is the debt that they will allow me to get. And then the question is, do I have a gap? Which you frequently do. You frequently have a gap.
Yes.
And that's a strange thing about Affordable. In my experience in market, so I did about 1.5 years of market, and now I've done Affordable for about 1.5 years. And I don't know what your experience is, but usually when we had problems in a market rate firm, we were going to the budget. What can we cut? What do we have to value engineer, or can we eke the rents, a little bit higher?
Yeah.
Well, the challenge that I experience with affordable housing is that you have demands from the city or the local municipality that says, you need to keep the standards up to a market rate. So you can't come in and cut these things. And so, yeah,
exactly.
you have this gap funding, and where does it come from? And yeah, so please continue.
Well, so that's the strange thing. You just go to the financing tab and you say, can we get $1 million here? Can we get $1 million there? I mean, it was really a culture shock for me to say, like, you think we're going to fix this by just going out and getting a couple, but that's really the culture. And surprisingly, there's a number of different avenues, both grants. I mean, we can talk about, I have, 9 or 10 different sources in my current project, but there is money out there.
9 or 10 different sources in your project.
Oh yeah.
Historical tax credits. I mean, what sort of other sources?
So I've got, I should have brought the model with me. So obviously we have the federal tax credit. Let me go through the stack here. We have the federal tax credit equity. We have a state donation tax credit where the housing authority is donating the land to itself in a different legal entity, which triggers a state donation tax credit, which is coming into the project as a loan. ...
Wow.
I love that.
There's a seller's note. There's a FAF loan from the tax credit agency. There's the permanent loan. There's
amazing.
What am I? I mean, it just goes. You can have. Go ahead.
No, actually, why don't you finish, Ben? Then I'll have a follow-up question.
Well, there's a lot of different places we can go. So why don't you go ahead? And we'll kind of pick it up.
So when you're looking at, a lot of our listeners right now, I mean, they're real estate financial modeling nerds like Michael and I are, and so they're asking themselves, is there a template model for this sort of thing, or Ben, are you sitting down and building a new model from scratch every time you're looking at a new deal? Like, I can't imagine a template being able to handle 9, 10 different sources of capital. And maybe it's you're plugging in unique modules and customizing certain modules. But talk to us then, from the technical standpoint, how are you modeling these deals?
Well, and we can go tab for tab, but I will say when I first got into it, there's no waterfall. There's no, comparing equity multiple hurdle to IRR hurdle, et cetera. There's none of that. And so I thought, boy, this is going to be really straightforward. It's almost laughably easy in comparison.
Yeah.
But kind of what I've learned is that, I don't know if you've ever had an old relative who was taking too many different kinds of medicine at once. And the medicines kind of start interacting with each other in unforeseen and you don't know why.
Yeah.
That's essentially what I would say is the difficulty with affordable. The revenue tab is quite straightforward. I mean, we have to use income averaging. So the rents have to average out to about 60% of the AMI, but it's all set. You look it up. It takes 2 seconds.
Yeah,
There's
you know exactly what your rents are going to be. I mean, that's nice.
I mean, it's set. It's, you may have to lower them from the max, but what the max is. So there's not a whole lot of fudge room there. You have to do a utility allowance to take out whatever their utilities are. So you do a utility study sometimes. And I mentioned the underwriting standards, but that's pretty straightforward. Lease up. No problem. I mean, at least in a month or two, there's 100%. 200%
sure.
demand.
Yeah, all pre-leased.
Thousands of applications for 100 units.
Right. Yeah. That's right. Operating expenses, because the buildings are small, they're not very operationally efficient. 70 units is not a great number for justifying full-time staff.
And really quick, is the reason they're small because you don't have access to sufficient tax credits in order to do larger projects, or like why are the smaller buildings?
Well, so if you want to get the most money, which is the 9%, the 9% track.
We'll talk a little more about that in a minute too.
That's right. That's right. So the 9% track is competitive. It gives you the most money. Usually it's maybe 70% of the total development cost, but it's capped. You can only request $1 million or $1.5 million times 10 times the credit price. So it becomes difficult, to get much more than $10-15 million in tax credits, which just starts limiting your size, especially if you're in one of these. I have a California project right now. I've had projects in recently looking at North Carolina, Chicago, and California. North Carolina, 200,000 a unit. Chicago, 410 a unit. Southern California, where I was, 600,000 a unit. It's still the same cap.
Yeah.
So
Same.
you just don't go very far.
Yeah. So that's San Francisco also, which is a whole nother
Oh yeah.
story.
Go ahead.
No, so, if I may, we were on a path, and this speaks to the underwriting question. We were on a path of, walking through the conceptual idea of underwriting a building, and we got to the land, we got to the construction budget, and then we got to this eligible basis that you mentioned. And you mentioned the 9%, doing this 9% factor, and there's also a 4% factor. And it's
That's right.
interesting that you go to the 9% because most of the people that I know in this space talk about 4%. And when they talk about 9%, maybe it's because it's California. I don't know. Maybe you can speak more to that. But 9% seems like unattainable to most. So maybe you could speak a little bit more about what this 4% and 9% is, and maybe talk a little bit more to that whole area.
Well, California in particular is discouraging people very subtly from using 9%. And they basically make I had a project that was going to be in the 55 million, 55 million or something. And, what was the developer going to fee? It was going to be really minimal. Mm-hmm. So you sit there and you're like, what's our pre-development risk going to be? And what's the development fee? Mm-hmm. Is this worth doing? It's not, so they have subtle ways, of doing that. Now, the 4% is an automatic thing. You apply for it and you get it. But the 4% rate floats. It's actually more like 3.25% right now.
Mm-hmm. And why does it float? What makes it?
What's the index that it floats over?
I think it's tied to the applicable federal rate. That's a good question. And if I had been on this longer, I would know. But
that's okay.
The 9% rate used to float, and it was pegged at 9%, which was a huge deal. Now I have a California project right now that I'm looking at, and if the 4% was actually 4%, which is to say, if I could take 4% times, type 10, so 40%, whatever, times the credit pricing and actually get, very nearly 40% of the cost, it'd be amazing. Because whatever, but it's not, you usually now get about 25% of the project. So you imagine your $30 million building, and to get these credits, you're going to obligate yourself to use, relatively low rents compared to the market. And as a reward, you're not going to get 70% of the capital stack in free money. You're going to get 25%. So then where are you going to get the rest? I mean, the city or the state. So a lot of times, and California just announced a $500 million state tax credit. So that helps. It's necessary, really. So then you can combine those, and you're right. I mean, we will sometimes combine them. Everybody would prefer to do 4% because, when you're looking across the room at the different people who you're competing with to get these credits, almost to a person, you respect them. You think that they are out trying to help people have safe, affordable places to live, especially those people who have kind of been dealt a bad hand. And for all of you to go to all this work and put together these amazing projects, and go through the bureaucracy and then not get it, and have only a third of you get it. It's just, it's really discouraging. And so everybody prefers 4%, but you often then have to go to the city and say, all right, that's going to be $7 million. I'm going to need you to plug this gap.
Yeah.
Yep. And so just to be very explicit, when you say 4% of the eligible basis of what qualifies as construction costs,
right?
What am I doing with this 4%? Like, so, okay, let's say it's 3.5%. It's not 4%. What does that mean? How am I using that with my?
So I'm taking that, basis? In this case, it's more like 3.25. So 3.25 times 10. Mm-hmm. So I'm at 32.5 times the credit price that I can get. So maybe, 95 cents or something. Mm-hmm. So you very often end up with, I didn't do the math real quick, but
that's fine.
So is that roughly 30% of your capital stack then comes from those 4%?
Right.
Okay.
30% as opposed to 65 or 70%,
Yeah.
but you have the same rents.
And so the person buying the tax credits, and I may be incorrect here, is that they every year of that 10-year period they get to take that. Like that's a write-off for them, whatever they buy it at, or whatever
Right.
that dollar amount is.
They don't get
that
to take the amount times 10, but they get, so over the
10
period, they're
years.
going to get that.
Yeah.
And
And that's why you're
so-
haircutting it to 95% because of the time value of money, correct?
And there's a
time
competitive
value of
market
money,
for it.
but
Well,
I mean, people have paid more, there are markets where people have paid well in excess of $1 for $1 of tax credit because
They need
You
they need the investments,
they,
right?
they need the investment, but you can also, I believe, and accountants have a field day with this industry, as you can imagine,
Yeah.
but I believe they can also count it as an expense, which is to say a tax, it comes off of their EBITDA or their NOI because they've bought this thing. So you're getting a reduction in your taxable income, and then you have a credit off of that tax
and the
obligation.
depreciation, right?
I
It goes to-
believe, don't quote me on that, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, look, this is a fascinating conversation, and
Right.
and those those of us who get in the weeds and really dig this stuff, I mean, we could go on for hours. We have limited time with Ben, so I want to get
Sure,
to
sure.
the birth of a building.
do you mind if I mention one thing?
Oh,
real
please
quick,
do.
just
Yeah,
because-
yeah.
Because one of the questions I'm sure that your listeners will have hearing all of this, minutia, is whether this is a good business or not.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, is
Good.
this just charity? So let me give you the really quick version of that. The positive side is you don't have to put any equity in. The developer doesn't have equity regardless of the size of the deal. So that was music to my ears because
But there's at least pursued equity, right? Or
sure, there's
Okay.
pre-development, but if you joint venture with a nonprofit, they can get a pre-development loan.
wow. Okay.
And in certain situations, you can get non-recourse loans, HUD D4 and so on. There's a generous developer fee. There's unlimited demand. And in year 15 or 30, you own this property free and clear, and it may be in a really amazing location. That's, so a lot of the actual return that you can make in affordable is at the end of your compliance period when you can flip this to something else. The downside is, as I mentioned, it's extremely competitive. The people who are giving you this money aren't in business, so they don't really have an incentive to make the process particularly intuitive. They're not trying to win your business like a private lender is. And you don't get much cash flow. They size it so you're kind of coasting out, and it adds a lot of time. Anyway, I just think it's interesting to keep those in mind because there's a lot of things that are really positive about it, and we haven't even talked about the amazing stories. But there's a lot of things that are positive about it from a business perspective. There's other things that are just make you pull your hair out. So those are the things I think people should balance, even once they know technically how to do the model and maybe how to find a site that scores well. Just the decision about, is this a good enough business for me to be in? Do I want to be in it? And how do I weigh the pros and cons that it brings?
Well, Ben, we appreciate you being here today. This has been absolutely awesome. And I think if you're okay with it, would you like to come back for another episode and talk more about your book, talk more about this topic? I mean, I was thoroughly entertained just by the stories and the history of, I was just blown away by that. Would you mind coming back for another episode?
Boy, I'd be happy to. I worry that I maybe talked a bit too much about it, but there's a lot to talk about. So yeah,
No,
more
absolutely.
than happy to come back.
No, it was wonderful. So, and I'm sure that everybody listening also feels that way. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. We will see you on the next episode.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Adventures in CRE audio series. For show notes and additional resources, head over to www.adventuresincre.com/audio series. Would you like to learn real estate financial modeling in a matter of weeks and do it with zero guesswork? If so, the a.cre Accelerator is for you. The Accelerator is a step-by-step, case-based program designed to teach you exactly what you need to know and in the order you need to know it, so you can gain both the knowledge and experience to take your career to the next level. To see if the Accelerator is right for you, go to www.adventuresincre.com/accelerator.